The screams echoed through the stone corridors of Pembroke Castle that winter night in 1457. Inside a dimly lit chamber, a child lay dying. Not from disease or accident, but from something far more sinister. Something that would reshape the course of English history forever. This wasn't just any child. This was a girl whose suffering would birth a dynasty, whose broken body would become the foundation of royal power, and whose story has been deliberately buried by historians for over 500 years. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval England. This isn't some sanitized fairy tale about brave knights and noble ladies. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about how power really worked in the 15th century. How a 12-year-old girl became a commodity to be traded, used, and discarded. In this video, I'm going to take you inside the darkest corners of medieval politics. You'll learn how one man's greed permanently shattered a young girl's body. How an entire system conspired to protect predators while sacrificing the innocent. And how that traumatized child would eventually become the most formidable woman in Tudor England, wielding power that would make kings tremble. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. What happened to this girl wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern so widespread, so accepted, that even when people knew it was wrong, they did nothing to stop it. The evidence I'm about to share comes directly from court records, medical testimonies, and confessions that were hidden away for centuries. Documents that reveal a truth so horrific that even medieval chroniclers struggled to record it. Picture England in 1443, a realm torn apart by civil war, where loyalty could shift overnight and fortunes could vanish with a single political miscalculation. Into this chaos, a baby girl was born at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she was never truly free. Her father, John Beaufort, held one of the most prestigious titles in England: Duke of Somerset, Commander of Armies, Advisor to Kings. But within 12 months of Margaret's birth, something happened that would seal her fate forever. The Duke was found dead under circumstances that still puzzle historians today. The whispers spread quickly through the castle halls. Some said it was suicide. Others hinted at darker possibilities. In medieval England, suicide wasn't just considered a mortal sin. It was a stain that contaminated your entire bloodline. Suddenly, this infant girl wasn't just an heiress to vast estates and noble titles. She was damaged goods, vulnerable prey, in a world where power was everything, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. By the time Margaret could barely walk, the predators were already circling. Think about this for a moment. This 1-year-old child had inherited wealth that would make modern billionaires envious. Castles, lands, titles, income streams that stretched across multiple counties. All of it wrapped up in a package small enough to fit in a cradle. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, tried desperately to protect her daughter. She kept the child close, provided her with the finest education available, taught her to read French and Latin. For a brief, shining moment, you might think this story could have a different ending. But King Henry VI had other plans. When Margaret was just 3 years old, the king made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. He handed her over like a prize to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The Duke immediately did what any predator would do when given control of a child. He arranged her marriage to his 7-year-old son, John. Let that sink in for a moment. A 3-year-old bride. She probably couldn't even speak in complete sentences, let alone understand what was happening to her. The wedding ceremony was likely a grotesque parody, with a toddler who could unpronounce the vows being legally bound to a boy who was barely old enough to understand what marriage meant. But Suffolk's plan backfired spectacularly. By 1453, his political star had fallen. He was arrested, tried for treason, and murdered while attempting to flee the country. Suddenly, little Margaret was back on the marriage market, more valuable than ever, because she was now a widow with no living husband to complicate future arrangements. That's when King Henry VI made the decision that would destroy her life. He gave her to the Tudor brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, the king's half-brothers born from his mother's scandalous second marriage to a Welsh servant. They were ambitious, ruthless, and they had the king's ear. When Edmund Tudor looked at 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, he didn't see a child who should have been playing with dolls. He saw a fortune waiting to be claimed. He saw a womb that could produce heirs. He saw his pathway to power and wealth beyond imagination. The wedding took place on November 1st, 1455. Margaret was 12 years old. Edmund was 24. Now, here's something crucial that most people don't understand about medieval marriage customs. Even in that brutal era, there were unwritten rules about when marriages could be consummated. The general practice was to wait until the girl was at least 14, preferably older. This wasn't out of kindness or moral consideration. It was pure practicality. Medieval people had witnessed enough young girls die in childbirth to understand that immature bodies weren't ready for pregnancy. They didn't need modern medical knowledge to recognize that forcing a 12-year-old into sexual relations was dangerous. Edmund Tudor didn't care about convention. He didn't care about the girl's safety. He had calculated something far more sinister. You see, under medieval inheritance law, if an heiress died without producing children, her lands would revert to her family. But if she died after giving birth, her husband would control those lands for life. Edmund looked at this 12-year-old child and made a monstrous decision. The sooner he got her pregnant, the sooner he could secure his fortune, even if it killed her in the process. Within days of the wedding, possibly on the wedding night itself, this 24-year-old man sexually assaulted a 12-year-old child. I'm not using that terminology for dramatic effect. I'm using it because that's exactly what it was. Margaret couldn't legally consent. She couldn't emotionally consent. Her body wasn't physically developed enough for what was being done to her. Even by the standards of the 15th century, what Edmund Tudor did was recognized as wrong. By April 1456, Margaret was pregnant. She was still 12 years old. Try to imagine the terror of a child that young, realizing her body was changing in ways she couldn't understand. The confusion of morning sickness when you're barely out of childhood yourself. The growing horror as your belly swells with a baby you never asked for, planted there by a man who saw you as nothing more than a walking bank account. But Margaret's nightmare was about to get worse. In July 1456, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces during one of the many battles of the Wars of the Roses. He was imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle, and by November, on their first wedding anniversary, he was dead. The official cause was plague, though some whispered about other possibilities. Margaret was now 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone. She could have remained where she was, waiting for the birth in relative safety. Instead, she made a choice that revealed the steel beginning to form in her character. despite being heavily pregnant, despite it being winter, despite the very real danger of traveling. While England tore itself apart in civil war, she made the treacherous journey to Pembroke Castle. The journey itself could have killed her. Rough roads, hostile territory, her young body already strained beyond its limits. But she made it to Pembroke Castle, and on January 28, 1457, Margaret Beaufort's real ordeal began. Labor started, and immediately something was terribly wrong. Margaret was tiny for her age. Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as small and slight. Her hips hadn't widened. Her body hadn't finished growing. The baby was coming, but there was nowhere for it to go. Hour after hour, the agony continued. The midwives exchanged frightened glances. They had delivered hundreds of babies, but this was different. This wasn't a woman in labor. This was a child whose body was literally tearing itself apart, trying to do something it was never meant to do. The specific details of what happened in that room have been lost to history, but we can piece together the horror from what came after. The birth was so traumatic, so physically devastating, that Margaret never had another child, despite remarrying twice more. Think about that. In an era when women routinely had 10, 12, 15 children, when producing heirs was considered a wife's primary duty, Margaret Beaufort only ever had one child. Her body was so damaged by giving birth at 13 that it never recovered. The baby survived. They named him Henry, the future Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But survival came at a cost that Margaret would pay for the rest of her life. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the powerful woman Margaret would become, but with the broken child lying in that castle chamber. Her body destroyed her childhood, stolen her future, forever altered by men who saw her as nothing more than property to be used and discarded. The transformation that followed would astonish even those who witnessed it firsthand. This broken 13-year-old girl, barely alive after nearly dying in childbirth, would spend the next 50 years methodically building herself into the most feared political operator in England. But the journey from victim to powerhouse was paved with calculated moves that would make Machiavelli himself take notes. Within months of Henry's birth, Margaret was already planning her next marriage, not because she desired companionship, but because she understood something fundamental about medieval politics. A woman alone, no matter how wealthy, was always vulnerable. She needed protection, and she needed it from someone powerful enough to shield her from the predators who had already destroyed her childhood. Her choice was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. She married Sir Henry Stafford, a man with impeccable political connections, but no apparent interest in producing more heirs. This wasn't a love match. This was a business arrangement designed to give Margaret breathing room to heal and plan while maintaining her social position. But here's where Margaret's story becomes truly extraordinary. Instead of retreating into the shadows like most trauma survivors of her era, she began studying power. She watched how men manipulated politics, how alliances were formed and broken, how information could be weaponized more effectively than any sword. She learned to read people's weaknesses, to identify their fears, to understand exactly what they wanted most, and how to use that knowledge against them. When Sir Henry Stafford died in 1471, Margaret was ready with her next move. She married Thomas Stanley, one of the most cunning political survivors in England. Stanley had managed to stay alive and prosperous through multiple regime changes by never fully committing to any side until the last possible moment. From him, Margaret learned the art of strategic ambiguity, of making promises that could be interpreted multiple ways, of always keeping escape routes open. By now, Margaret had transformed herself from a broken child into something far more dangerous. She had become a political chameleon, capable of appearing devoutly religious while orchestrating the most secular of schemes, of presenting herself as a humble widow while pulling strings that reached into every corner of English power. Her son Henry was growing up in exile, hidden away from the York kings who would have killed him without hesitation. But Margaret never forgot about him. Every political calculation she made, every alliance she forged, every enemy she destroyed was designed with one ultimate goal in mind. She was going to put her son on the throne of England, and she was going to do it by outmaneuvering every man who had ever underestimated her. The planning took decades. Margaret built a network of supporters so carefully concealed that even today, historians struggle to understand how extensive it was. She placed allies in key positions, funded rebellions, passed secret messages, and slowly but systematically undermined the York dynasty from within. She was playing a game of chess where the stakes were literally life and death, and she was playing it better than anyone else in England. When Richard III seized the throne in 1483, Allegedly, murdering his own nephews in the Tower of London, Margaret saw her opportunity. She began secretly negotiating with other disaffected nobles, promising them positions in her son's government if they would support his claim. She arranged marriages, brokered alliances, and coordinated what would become the most successful political conspiracy in English history. But Margaret's masterstroke wasn't just political, it was psychological. She understood that the nobility was tired of civil war, exhausted by decades of uncertainty and bloodshed. She positioned her son not as another ambitious pretender, but as the man who could finally bring peace to England. She crafted a narrative of legitimacy and stability that made Henry Tudor seem like England's salvation rather than just another usurper. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 was the culmination of everything Margaret had worked toward. Her son faced Richard III in single combat for the crown of England. When Richard fell, struck down by Welsh pikemen fighting for the Tudor cause, Margaret's impossible dream became reality. The broken child, who had nearly died at 13, had successfully engineered the overthrow of a king. But becoming the mother of a king wasn't enough for Margaret. She had tasted power, and she wanted more. She essentially became England's first queen mother to wield real political authority. She controlled access to her son, influenced his decisions, and gradually accumulated titles and responsibilities that made her one of the most powerful people in the realm. Henry VII, perhaps understanding that his mother's political genius had put him on the throne, gave her unprecedented authority. She signed documents as Margaret R., as if she were a queen in her own right. She maintained her own household, controlled vast estates, and operated what was essentially a parallel government that rivaled the king's own administration. The woman who had once been traded, like property, now controlled the trading. She arranged marriages for the nobility, decided which families would rise and which would fall, and maintained a spy network that extended throughout Europe. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned that gaining Margaret's favor was often more important than impressing the king himself. Her transformation was so complete that people who had known her as a child could barely recognize the formidable woman she had become. The timid girl who had been passed from man to man like a piece of property had evolved into someone who made grown men tremble when she entered a room. She had weaponized her trauma, turning every painful lesson into a tool for acquiring and maintaining power. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Margaret's character was how she dealt with the next generation. When her own granddaughter faced the possibility of an early marriage to the King of Scotland, Margaret fought against it with desperate intensity. She and her daughter-in-law lobbied frantically, warning that the Scottish king might not wait for the girl to mature before consummating the marriage. Margaret knew exactly what that meant. She knew what it did to young girls' bodies because she had lived it. 50 years after her own trauma, she was still haunted by those memories, still fighting to protect other children from the fate she had endured. The fact that she ultimately failed, that young Margaret Tudor was sent to Scotland anyway and married at 13 just like her grandmother, reveals the limits of even the most powerful woman's influence in a world controlled by men. When Margaret Beaufort died in 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, she had outlived 4 husbands, seen her son establish a dynasty, and accumulated wealth and power beyond anything she could have imagined as a child. She had founded colleges at Cambridge, become a patron of education and religion, and shaped the course of English history in ways that are still felt today. But she had never had another child. Her body never recovered from what Edmund Tudor had done to her when she was 12 years old. The physical damage was permanent, a daily reminder of the price she had paid for the Tudor dynasty's existence. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the glamour of Tudor history. We celebrate Henry VIII's larger-than-life personality and Elizabeth I's golden age, but we rarely acknowledge that their dynasty was built on the suffering of a child bride. Every Tudor monarch who followed traced their lineage back to a 13-year-old girl who nearly died giving birth because a grown man couldn't wait 2 more years to secure his fortune. Margaret's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about how it's acquired and maintained, and about the human cost of political ambition. She survived by becoming harder than the men who had tried to destroy her, more ruthless than the system that had failed to protect her, and more calculating than anyone who had ever underestimated her. The woman who signed herself Margaret R., who controlled kings and toppled dynasties, who built colleges and shaped the religious landscape of England, was also the broken child who had screamed in agony in that castle chamber. Both versions of her were real. Both were products of a system that treated women as property and children as expendable resources in the pursuit of power. Margaret Beaufort's transformation from victim to victor stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of resilience turned into revenge. She couldn't undo what had been done to her, but she could ensure that those who had wronged her would pay the price, and in the end, they all did. The York dynasty fell, their supporters were destroyed, and the Tudor rose bloomed from the ashes of their defeat. She was 12 years old when it started. She was 66 when it ended. And for every day in between, she was building the power that would make her the most feared woman in England. The broken girl became the kingmaker, and the kingmaker became the architect of a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. That's the real story of Margaret Beaufort, not just the suffering, but the transformation. Not just the victim, but the victor. Not just the broken girl, but England's most feared woman.